Welcome to Unlocking Bach, audio program notes for upcoming concerts in Music Worcester's The Complete Bach. I'm Artistic Director Dr. Chris Shepard. Join me as we climb into the miraculous mind of Johann Sebastian Bach. Hello everyone and welcome back. This is season 2 of The Complete Bach and the first Unlocking Bach of the year. We have so many exciting things planned this year. I'm going to suggest some of those during this podcast today, but also I really want to take a longer look at one particular piece, BWV170, and we will get to that in a moment. But first, I've had a number of questions from people about how do we plan and choose and schedule all the different works as they come up. And I have to say there's no real science behind it. I wanted to give you a glimpse behind the curtain and tell you a little bit about what happens. With the major ensembles, for example, they often pitch an idea to us because they are on tour with a certain work, or you might think of a pianist like Jeremy Denk last year who played the complete partitas. Well, pianists or any instrumentalist for that matter don't necessarily have all the repertoire in their fingers at any given point. So if they or their manager gets in touch and says, we have this work for you, do you have a place for it? Well, then we jump at that. And you can't really plan 11 years at once because of that. And then of course, there are those pieces that everybody wants to perform. I think in particular of the Goldberg variations, everybody would like that slot. The solo violin and the solo cello works, you heard Zladimir Fung last year play the cello suites. Well, there are just not very many of those works in Bach's canon, and so you have to choose just one performer, even though all of us would probably enjoy hearing a different performer play the cello suites every year, or the violin solo partitas, works like that. But you just have to make a decision, and again, sometimes it's because it's somebody who's going to be coming to the area anyway, and we engage them. There are so many amazing players and singers out there, and we just have to, at some point, say, yep, we're going to choose this person. There are major organ works. We haven't really ramped up yet all of the organ works. That's something that I'm saving a little bit later so that we can have different celebrations, mini marathons, and things like that. But there are many works that people have asked me, can I do the St. Anne Prelude and Fugue, for example? But not everybody can. So we just have to figure out a way to squeeze in as many as you can. And then for the singers, there are a number of solo cantatas. These are the cantatas that don't require choir. There might be a chorale at the end, but they are largely a solo work. And these are beloved of soloists. You're going to hear two of the major examples of those this year. One is a piece called Ich habe genug, which I believe is one of the greatest pieces that Bach ever wrote, BWV 82. And I jumped at the chance to be able to include Kevin Diaz, who's one of the great singers in the Northeast. I know him from his singing in New York City, although interestingly, we did a St. Matthew Passion together in Mexico City several years ago, and he was an extraordinary Jesus in that. So it is so wonderful to have him this season doing the Bach Christmas Oratorio with us, and I really wanted to include that cantata. And then for altos, for mezzo-sopranos, or for countertenors, BWV 170 is absolutely beloved. And we will talk about that today. We will get to that in a moment. But I would say that I had the opportunity this year to include that piece twice. And every once in a while in these 11 years, because there's a little scope for repetition and still fit everything in, because we were approached at the same time by the musicians of the Old Post Road to schedule BWV 170 with Carrie Charon and Simone Dinnerstein and Baroquelin from their recent recording of the same work with Jennifer Johnson Kano, I thought that it would be really great to include both of those performances. And let me tell you why. This year, the second year of the Complete Bach, is the year of the contrast between the use of modern instruments and the use of period instruments. And I've scheduled a number of opportunities for you to mix and match and compare and contrast. I think we are at the point in the evolution of the use of period instruments where it has become acceptable again to present both types. For a long time, you really couldn't perform Bach with modern instruments without critics saying that you've done something very, very bad. From the time of the reappearance, I should say, of period instruments, sometimes called original instruments or authentic instruments, this happened in the late 1960s and really ramped up in the 1970s and 80s. It became really important that all major public performances really needed to be done with those instruments. That was important for a time. It recalibrated our ears to understand so much about Bach's music and what it sounded like at the time. But at the same time, we have learned, those of us who perform more often, as I do with modern instruments, we have learned to take so many of those lessons from the period instruments with, for example, gut strings, and that's exactly what it sounds like. In the 18th and even into the 19th centuries, the violin strings were not made of metal, they were made from catgut, if you can imagine that. Very different sound. It's a mellower sound. The strings were not under the same degree of tension, so the sound is really very different. Things like a wooden flute, for example. The oboe was different. The reed was shaped a little bit more different. And so the timbre of period instruments was so different, particularly at the beginning of that movement. And it really blew the minds of so many performers. We're now in a time where we are used to that sound, and we have found ways to make modern instruments speak in a similar way. The great reason for using modern instruments, in my mind, is the democratization of the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. For a few decades, Bach had become the property of specialists, and that was an important period, as I said, because we needed to be taught so much about how those authentic performance practices were in the 18th century. But now, let's return this music to everybody, so you don't need to be a specialist on period instrument, but you do need to have learned from them. So what do I mean by that for this year? Well, we have a number of period instrument ensembles. The musicians of the Old Post Road from Massachusetts, fantastic performers on period instruments. We have musicians from the Winchendon Music Festival with Andrew Arcecci, who's a wonderful friend of the Complete Bach. It is the ensemble that he leads. They will be joining the Worcester Chorus to perform the Christmas Oratorio, half of that work, in January. And then one of my favorite American period ensembles, the Sebastians from New York City, and they will be performing the Brandenburg Concerti. So that's how we are representing the period ensembles. From the modern instrument end, we have Simone Dinnerstein with her wonderful new ensemble, Baroquelin, playing, as I say, on modern instruments, but definitely incorporating those techniques learned from period instruments with a particular twist, and that is that Simone plays piano. And that harkens back to composers like Mendelssohn and Schumann in the 19th century. They didn't use the harpsichord. The harpsichord was only really rediscovered late in the 19th century and the early 20th century. They might have used organs, certainly, but piano was acceptable. So we are, in a sense, resurrecting a performance tradition that is itself valid as history, but from a different standpoint. And in the hands of somebody like Simone, there are revelations to be returned to that timbre as well. She plays on the Saturday night of BACHtoberfest Weekend with Alexis Gerlach playing the viola da gamba sonatas, but on cello with piano, which is one way of performing those works. Our Worcester Bach Collective Orchestra, who you hear a few times during the year, particularly performing cantatas in BACHtoberfest Weekend, and again for the Bach Birthday Bash in March, they play on modern instruments, but again, incorporating those techniques learned from the period movement. And then we are bringing Emmanuel Music, that extraordinary ensemble from Boston, that has been performing a cantata every Sunday for more than 50 years, and they play on modern instruments as well. Then we have one concert in the Bach Birthday Bash weekend on Saturday, where you can, for yourself, compare and contrast the two performance traditions, with Fred Jodry playing harpsichord for half the program and Christian Imperio playing piano for the other half. And you can see what you like. We are at a moment of détente between these two worlds, the period instrument world and the modern instrument world, and it means that you can decide for yourself. There are pros and cons to both, and I personally think it's wonderful to hear Bach played on a panoply of different instruments, because one of the most extraordinary aspects of the music of Johann Sebastian Bach is that it is transmutable to so many different platforms. There are composers like Monteverdi whose music really only makes sense if you use those period instruments. But then somebody like Bach, whose music is somehow more pure and transcends the limitations of any instrument, that music can be heard in so many different ways. And when you hear it in different ways, you hear it with different ears. And that is something that I believe very strongly as a great lover of the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. So I said there are those works that everybody lobbies me to get to perform. BWV170. This is a solo cantata by Johann Sebastian Bach, Vergnügte Ruh, which means delightful rest. We say solo cantata, but the interesting thing is that most of those, what we call solo cantatas, there are about 50 of them that are extant, are really cantatas that feature different soloists. So there might be a soprano aria and a tenor aria and alto recitative, something like that, in the mix in these 20 to 25 minute pieces. There are only about a dozen cantatas that are purely solo, meaning that only one voice sings the whole time. And not surprisingly, these are the works that solo singers would like to sing because they're wonderful challenges to them. It is a 20 to 25 minute of solo singing, so just technically that is difficult enough. But the other thing is that with those contrasting movements, as you'll see in a moment, that provides a wonderful, almost operatic, expressive challenge to singers. So they love them. There are 4 cantatas written for soprano only, 5 for alto only, which is quite interesting. It suggests that Bach really loved the alto voice, and I believe he did. And then 2 that are for bass, including the one that Kevin Diaz will sing in January. I've been saying alto, but I should make a point. For Bach, the people who sang alto for him were boys whose voices had not changed. But we think because of lesser nutritional value in that era, this may be the reason why boys hit puberty much later. So what would be a boy alto now, their voice might change around 13 or 14. These boys, so-called, were about 17 or even 18 when their voice changed. So imagine, they had been singing with Bach from a very young age, these boy trebles who might have been 8, 9, 10. So they had imbibed his musical style and the challenges of his music for that whole time. These were bright boys because the school that they went to in Leipzig was a very academic school where they also received a great deal of musical education. They probably all or almost all of them played an instrument at a fairly high level. So these boy altos at the age of 17 or 18 were probably quite sophisticated musicians. And the boy's voice, right before it changes, the musculature has developed, so there is some real strength to the voice. So it is very difficult today to replicate what that voice would have sounded like. Yes, it would sound like a boy these days at 13 or 14 on the cusp of their voice change, but they are a little bit older, so it would be a little bit different, and it is very difficult to replicate the amount of musical training that they would have had. I would caution everybody by saying that a countertenor, though comes close to that sound, it is not the same thing. Countertenor is the use of a certain kind of technique to exploit the possibility for head voice, something like falsetto in the male voice, in the adult male voice. So that's not quite the same. I personally think that actually the female contralto, the lower register of a female, probably is a little closer to what those boys sounded like. When period instrument ensembles do these cantatas for alto, they often use countertenor. As it turns out, we have 2 mezzo-sopranos, so you'll get to compare how that voice type sounds with period instruments, with Old Post Road, and then modern instruments with Simone Dinnerstein and Barocklin. So why 170? Why do they love this so much? Well, it has everything that singers love. There is an incredibly lyrical first movement. The central aria is thorny and expressive in a very different way. And then there is a more lighthearted, joyful, and somewhat more florid resolution movement at the end. So I think that that is why 170 is a particularly beloved cantata for solo mezzo-sopranos. Let's look at that first movement. Delightful rest, beloved pleasure of the soul. What this whole cantata looks at is the idea that we can only find rest in faith in God and following His precepts. Peace and concord cannot be found among the sins of hell. So all the way through this cantata, you're going to have the contrast between the peace and then that thorny affliction that sets in for people who don't follow God but follow their own sinfulness. The first movement of this BWV170 cantata is unbelievably beautiful. And why is it so beautiful? I think it's because of the bass part. The bass part of the opening of this first movement sounds like this. It's just a scale down. And you think that's simple, but I can think of a number of examples where some of Bach's most beautiful writing is based on that bass line. Let me give you a good example. The air on the G string, and it's just a scale down, but somehow those chords inspire Bach to write incredibly beautiful music. Another one of the most beautiful arias ever written, from the St. Matthew Passion, Mache dich mein Herze rein, make my heart pure, O Lord. In the second measure, the scale starts. Here's the scale. It's just a scale going down, and it is so incredibly beautiful. By the way, there's another example that isn't Bach. You know this, I believe. The Pachelbel Canon. And if you have keen ears, you're saying to yourself, but that's not a scale. He jumps, but in fact, it really is a scale. It's just a redistribution of those pitches. Let me play it with the scale. So the idea is still a scale. The descending scale produces really beautiful harmonies. So let me show you what this sounds like at the beginning of BWV 170. Isn't that just great? Orchestra alone. really embodies that sense of peace in the text. Let me play a little bit from the solo alto part. It's the same part in the orchestra, but this just feels like a slightly embellished scale itself. I just think that is absolutely beautiful. The orchestra, it's very interesting for this cantata because it is just strings with an oboe d'amore, which is that slightly lower than a normal oboe. And Bach used the normal oboe, but then the oboe d'amore is the, we might say, mezzo-soprano version. The English horn is the alto version. It is just a little bit lower, but still a high-range instrument. It has a slightly more plaintive, slightly richer sound to it. But what's very interesting is that in this cantata, Bach doesn't use it separately. The oboe d'amore only ever doubles the first violin. And I think that what that does is that it adds even more beauty to that violin sound, and it fills it out just a little bit. Listen to that opening one more time, knowing now that that top line is violin 1 with oboe d'amore. Now I'm going to take a tiny detour, hoping that you have listened to the Bach 101 episode about concertos, and particularly about the ritornello, because this is a wonderful example of how a ritornello works. Just to review for that, a ritornello, which means to return, obviously, from the Italian, it comes back throughout the movement, and in fact, the melodic material that the singer sings is grafted onto that ritornello. So in a sense, the ritornello generates all the musical material. There are 3 sections to it. There is the opening and the closing. That's all you need to know for right now. So let me just show you what that means. The opening presents the material for a few bars. Then the closing returns us, because when the singer comes in, it's going to be the ritornello again. So that material in the beginning, the opening statement, which in German, and you don't need to know this, but since I taught you the word, I'll use it again. It is the Vordersatz, which is just simply the opening statement. And then that final epilogue, which is really to just get us into the key. In this case, sounds like this. It's just a little cadence, so that wherever we have gone far afield, it returns us back. And then the real body of the ritornello is that Fortspinnung, which just means the spinning forth, and it's a lot of sequences where you take one idea and repeat it higher or lower. Let me show you what I mean by that. Here is the first one. Do you hear that? Bum, bum, ba, lower. And then listen to what he does. That he takes a fragment and brings that lower. And then another little sequence. So this middle section just spins all of that out. Here's the whole ritornello. That opening theme or subject. Then listen for sequences. And then we get to to that epilogue to get us back to the key. And then the alto comes in. So I just wanted to show you that ritornello and show you how Bach establishes what we call an affect, a sense of, a feeling of, that feeling of rest, delightful rest, beloved pleasure of the soul, which can only be found in the concord of heaven. So in that first movement, it is as if the singer has embraced only the view of God and has rejected Satan. But we need the contrast, don't we? So in this quite remarkable middle aria, here is the text in English. How the perverted hearts afflict me, which are so sorely, my God, set against you. I truly tremble and feel 1,000 pangs when they rejoice only in vengeance and hate. So that the believer is being assailed by the sinfulness of the world and by those people who do not believe in God. How is Bach going to portray this? Well, he uses one of my favorite techniques. He uses this rarely. You would not want to overuse it. Because this text is talking about the people who reject God, Bach wanted to use a form of music that he uses to represent the absence of God. And this is referred to as bassetto, which means the little bass. When Bach wants to write music where God is absent, for example, in the St. Matthew Passion, when God has to turn away from Jesus on the cross, he gets rid of the basso continuo. He gets rid of the cello and the double bass. And he uses instead, as the little bass, the violins and the violas playing in unison. So they become the bass line, but it's not low. So there is an emptiness to the texture. Here is that bass line. F sharp minor, by the way. Wasn't that interesting? That is also just a scale down. But the way that he uses it harmonically is totally different from the peace and concord of the first movement. From that beautiful thing, in this case, he uses a minor key, F sharp minor. And by the way, whenever you have a key with a lot of sharps, because the word for sharp in German is related to the word for cross, Kreuz. For example, a double sharp is called a Doppelkreuz. We can think that Bach is referring to crucifixion in some way. This is obviously not always going to be true, but I do think that it's true in a sense here, this sense of affliction. And these are people who have not accepted the truth of the cross in their life. Listen to what the melodic material does against that bassetto line. Just fantastic. Those dropping, drooping, sighing sequence. And it's so thorny with those chromatics. Never really wants to settle in. And it's a little snake-like. Whenever Bach wants to use word painting to illustrate Satan, he often will use something snake-like. Satan as serpent. That sense of agony, and it's a double agony. It's the agony of the non-believer, because their life will never be rich without God, but it's also the agony of the believer who is persecuted by the non-believer. So all of this together paints such a different picture from the rest and concord of the opening movement. Now, you may have noticed I didn't say who plays this. I did say that the bassetto is played by the unison strings. There's no oboe d'amore in this. Do you know what is really fascinating? Bach wrote this for solo organ. We call this organ obbligato. You are obliged to play the notes that are written. Usually the organ or the harpsichord will improvise the part from the bass line that Bach has written with a almost jazz-like tabulature. He gives these little numbers that tell you what chords to play. But sometimes, even in the cantatas, Bach will write out an organ part that the organist will have to play verbatim. And that produces an unexpected color. And I think that's why he's using that here. So you get this incredible thorniness here. The use of sharps, which suggests that the cross is at work as an agent of change, but also the idea that Christ was persecuted on the cross, as is the believer. When the alto comes in, they sing this. Let me just play that one more time. Scales up. So how the perverted hearts afflict me. When you hear this in performance, you will be so struck by the ascetic nature of that instrumentation. And I must say, I find that Simone Dinnerstein's use of piano instead of organ even more powerful somehow. There is just such beauty in that playing. It's quite an extraordinary movement. There's one little bit of text painting that I wanted to show. This line, when they rejoice only in vengeance and hate. The word is rach, and it is here that the alto gets to use fireworks. So Rach, vengeance, she sings und Rach und Hass, an Rach und Hass, with vengeance, Rach, and Hass, hatred. And you just get this sense of the roiling of Satan in the background with all those fast-moving notes. So how is this cantata, which has now taken a very dark turn, how is it going to be resolved? Because these cantatas always have some kind of resolution in the end. Well, I don't know how much we as moderns love the way it gets resolved, but it is a distinctly 18th century Lutheran idea, which is to achieve real peace, I want to die and be with God. Sorry, that is the happy ending, but it is. That's the thing about Lutheran theology, is that everything on earth is but a shadow of what we will attain in heaven. So in the recit that I won't do, the fourth movement, they sing, who should hereafter wish indeed to live here, when only hatred and hardship is the answer to love. Thus my heart flees from anger and bitterness and wishes only to live with God. So let me play, before I tell you what the text is of the last movement, this is how it starts. I just think this is so lovely. Isn't that wonderful? This reminds me so much of pieces like the peasant cantata or the wedding cantata. It has a folk music feel to it. And then listen to what the organ does going on. You hear that dum, digga-dum, 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 digga-dum. This figure, dum, digga-dum, 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 in the Baroque musical lexicon represented joy. So this is the simplicity of faith. And then the joy. So it combines the idea of the simplicity of I want to live with God with this idea of, and when I do, when I am in heaven, I will experience that joy. With that dum digga-dum digga-dum, it is referred to as the corte, K-O-R-T-E, the corte figure representing joy. And so often, by the way, when you see that word Freude or some form of that word, Bach will use that rhythm. Something that's very interesting about the opening of it is why I've played it a number of times. There is something very anticipatory. It does not begin like this, in the key that it really is in. Instead, it begins on a chord which leads us to this chord, and then finally to the key that we're in. It makes it very attractive, almost like you're starting a sentence halfway through. And I think that represents the sense of anticipation for the believer who wants to go to heaven. I just wanted to show you one tiny little bit that is extremely florid, and in the organ part, this is again that organ obbligato, it is written out, has all of this incredibly happy florid playing. Listen to this. Isn't that wonderful? It is so virtuosic. In fact, it's funny because that sort of writing is often for violins, but he's having it played by the organ here. I imagine that he probably led this cantata from the organ himself and wrote this part out for himself. It's often hard to know. But if nothing else, it is certainly a virtuosic, very exciting organ part. So there it is. There's an overview of 170. I hope that gave you a sense of why so many of my alto friends have asked if they could do BWV170. You're lucky to hear it twice within a month. Once at the beginning of October, once at the end of October, to compare the different ways that it can be done with different instruments. So that is our first Unlocking Bach for the second year of the Complete Bach. I look forward to so many more where you can join me and we can again climb into the magical mind of Johann Sebastian Bach. See you all in October. Thanks so much.